I don't know if do you find that in like do you teach also or were you at
Yes, I
one
do.
point?
Yes.
Do you find that with
Yeah, I
like
mean, I teach at a middle school, and so we have a rule that they're not even allowed to bring phones into the classroom. That said, we occasionally have to confiscate them. So from day to day, there's a little bin in the office with 3 or 4 cell phones at any given time.
wow, I can't imagine. I didn't have my first phone until like halfway through high school, but now
Mm.
kids in middle school are having phones.
Oh yeah, yeah,
Oh jeez.
yeah. I mean, what's the next frontier is the smartwatch, because like you can't really tell them, take your watch off before class. It's crazy.
Wow. Let me. I'll give you a quick introduction, Sean, and for everybody out there, thank you very much for tuning in and listening. My name's Chris. This is Chee-Tash, and today I have a great guest with us. Please welcome Sean Munger. And Sean, if you can please introduce yourself and give a little summary of what you do.
Thanks. Well, thanks, Chris. Glad to be here. My name is Sean Munger, and I'm a historian. I'm known at this time primarily for my YouTube channel, which is just my name, Sean Munger. But I teach history courses both online and in person. So I'm a teacher. I've written several books, a couple, actually most fiction, believe it or not, although I have written some historical books. I am an academically trained historian. I have a PhD in environmental history. Before going back to school to get that advanced degree, which is my first love, was history, I was a lawyer, and I practiced commercial real estate law in the Pacific Northwest for a number of years. So I've worn a number of different hats over the course of my career, but I really enjoy history and engaging people with it, and talking about historical narratives. And I seem to have found a niche on YouTube. I've also run some podcasts in my past as well. Years ago, I produced a historical podcast called Second Decade, which is about the 18 teens, the second decade of the 19th century. That was tangentially related to study I was doing at the PhD level. And then I also had a podcast about movies called Green Screen, which is about environmental themes in popular movies. Because I am an environmental historian. A lot of that was historically based. So if you listen to Green Screen, which is fairly obscure, and there hasn't been a new episode published in a long time, but there's some environmental history that you'll pick up from that as well. So that's pretty much it.
Mhm. And I definitely want to ask you about some of the things that you just mentioned. One thing I wanted to dwell on really quick regarding we were talking about in your classroom with phones and watches. Have you had any sort of interactions with students who use Chat GPT?
I haven't really, because that is fairly new, and the school where I teach, we kind of de-emphasize written assignments in part for those reasons. So I don't really have much opportunity to see GPT. I have used it myself in a just to develop ideas and things like that. I've never published obviously anything either on my channel or anywhere else that is AI generated. I generally distrust AI, but I am aware that that is an issue among teachers these days, and they're having a really hard time dealing with it.
I was actually going to ask too, if in your experience using it, have you come across instances, especially with history, where you've noticed it getting stuff wrong? Because in my career, and I'm a software developer, and
Mhm,
I've asked it some questions actually that it's got wrong, and it kind of
mhm.
surprised me, like, oh, wow, that's not right. Have you ever experienced that?
Oh, sure. I mean, it happens all the time. It strings words together on the spur of the moment, basically. And the problem with AI is it doesn't think very deeply about anything that it's talking about. It just comes up with what it thinks are the best words to say at that particular instant. And each instant in time that it's operating is disconnected from everything else that it's that has come before that. So you can't really have a deep, you can simulate a deep conversation with it, but you can't really have one because it's not thinking on an analytical level really in any way.
Hmm. The previous guest I had on, we were also talking about ChatGPT, and they do a podcast about science and technology. And they actually informed me of another sort of AI tool called Pi, which is kind of like ChatGPT, but it's more of a conversation with an AI.
Mm,
And to, like, I think you had mentioned this just a little bit ago, like developing ideas, and it's kind of meant for that, like having a conversation with an AI to flush things out. And
mhm,
the cool thing about it is it actually can hook up, because it's a mobile app. You can actually speak to it
mhm.
versus ChatGPT. Right now, you just type, and I thought that was really cool. I started using it, not the voice part, but just typing to it, and it is different than ChatGPT. Like it really does seem like you're having a conversation with it, which is kind of cool. But yeah, I can't imagine going to school right now having these AI tools at your disposal. Back when I was in school, it was still, we were using Spark Notes and Cliff Notes. Now I feel
Mhm.
like it's just a whole nother level now, and it must be
Yeah,
challenging.
yeah, it is. And when I started my PhD program and started teaching college students, in this was in the early 20 teens, about 2010 or whatever, and uh, there were still students at that point who thought that Wikipedia was a secret weapon. And so we would have to, like, when we had an exam or a paper or something, we would have to at least sort of browse the main Wikipedia pages of the subjects that we were looking at, just to see if we could spot. And there's, we would have assignments uploaded through Blackboard or whatever software that would often check that. But that at that time, that was like kind of, that was still working its way through the system. So this is sort of the same, same crap, different day. It's just another, computer tool.
Mm-hmm. Pivoting slightly to your career and what you've studied with history, was there a particular like person or historical event that caused you to like really fall in love with this area of study and choosing to pursue it?
Well, I've always been interested in it. When I was in my graduate study, of course, I had to choose. I did a master's first, and then a PhD built on that. And I had to choose like a dissertation topic. And I had recalled something that I'd read, years and years and years ago, back in, I don't know, middle school at some point, and it was an article of some kind, but it was about the year without summer. Which all I remembered about it was there was some kind of weird alteration in the weather, and it was like snowing in June in New England. This was in 1816, and there were all these weird weather effects. And I was very curious when I got to the college level and then eventually the graduate level, that like very few people had written about that. It was always sort of like it was on the Reader's Digest level of history. It's like, oh wow, this weird thing happened. Isn't that strange? And then you move on. And I got very interested in that event. And so I started, when I was casting about for topics, I started researching, seeing what research there was on it, and there was very little. So that event really pulled me in because it was kind of untrammeled ground. I mean, historians hadn't really looked at it. Scientists had looked at it because it was caused by a volcanic eruption. Um, but what I discovered was that it was not one event. It was not one year. It was about a 10-year period of fairly intense global climate change that was volcanically induced. And there were a lot of different effects to it and a lot of different dimensions that people hadn't really talked about. So that really kind of drew me in, and that ended up being the subject of my dissertation.
And you mentioned earlier too that you have a law degree as well.
Hmm. Yeah,
And did you practice law for a time?
I I did. Yes, for a number of years. Yeah.
Wow. In what particular area?
I did mostly commercial real estate. So I was a business lawyer. I was not a litigator in any way. Um, but I did mostly commercial real estate and some general business law. At the very beginning of my legal career, I was working with a tax attorney, so I did a little bit of tax work. And then toward the end, after I got out of uh, graduate school, I tried to sort of combine my historical knowledge with my legal expertise. And for a while, I was a consultant on issues of climate change because during my dissertation, I became very interested in and knowledgeable about the history of uh, climate and weather in general, and of course, our current episode of man-made, human-caused global warming, the history of that and how that developed, how that was discovered, and that sort of thing. And so I had kind of a period where I was doing some consulting work, sort of based on that, but also kind of practicing law on the side. It didn't really fit together that well. And then pandemic era, I kind of just went out of the law profession entirely, with no regrets about that. And so I've been focusing on history pretty much since then.
I I have to now add you to the list of a long. It's a growing list of former like attorneys or lawyers that I've interviewed, and it's
Mhm.
crazy. I remember like the second interview I ever did was an author. He wrote fiction novels, and he was an attorney. Then I interviewed another woman author. She wrote a book about beer, but she was a former lawyer too, and yeah, crazy. And
Yeah.
then my
Well,
friend's a bankruptcy attorney, and I'm just surrounded by everybody, lots
yeah.
of people with
Well,
legal.
it's been sort of a truism in my life that every former attorney that I know is much happier than every attorney that I know. So that tells you something about the profession.
Mm. Now, when did the thought about starting this YouTube channel and podcasting, like how did that come about?
Well, it was in and shortly after my graduate study. The podcast came about. I started Second Decade in 2016, so it was uh, toward the end of my study. And what I was finding, I was writing my dissertation, and I had done a lot of research in various archives and things like that. And I had found so many interesting, because really the the episode of volcanic climate change that resulted in the year without summer really stretched over an entire decade. So I was really studying that whole decade of the 18 teens, basically. And I had so much material that I couldn't really fit into my dissertation, but was still really good and interesting stuff that people hadn't known about. And I've always had a creative side, and this is when kind of DIY podcasts were just sort of ramping up, and it was easy at that time to do that. And so I'm like, well, why don't I start a podcast and I'll do an episode about something that's not in my dissertation, but that's really interesting that occurred during this period. And so I started doing that, and it became somewhat popular, which surprised me. And throughout this whole period, I think I started my blog originally in like 2011 or 2012, and it was originally a way to promote my novels, my fiction books, but I kind of quickly sort of outran that model and just started just writing blog articles about whatever struck my fancy, a lot of history, a lot of various things. And that eventually developed a pretty stable core readership. And I had done some articles that were particularly a few that got a lot more hits than everything else. And in, I guess, 2017 or so, about kind of toward the end of my PhD program, I was talking to a fellow graduate student, and he's like, "Yeah, you should start a YouTube channel." He's like, "Yeah, I started one, and it's fun. It's a lot of work, but it's a good way to kind of blow off steam and that kind of thing." And this guy, actually, I subscribed to his channel. It's called Games with Jeff. He hasn't even really updated it in a very long time, but he's the one who spurred me to start a YouTube channel and kind of look at it in at least a semi-systematic way. So I started working with that, I guess, about a year after I had left. I had gotten my PhD, and I was like, well, what kind of, obviously I should do some historical videos. And I thought, well, what I'll do is I'll make a couple of videos based on my most popular blog articles. I'll just do video versions of those because the blogs have already been written for a long time. The script already exists. I might as well just see what I can do. So that kind of became, and my most popular blog article at that time was about the Oak Island. I'm going to put it in quotes, mystery. It's not a mystery, but it's sort of a myth. The idea that there's treasure buried on this small, or something of value buried on this small island off the coast of Nova Scotia. I wasn't even aware until I made the video version that there was a TV show about this that was explaining that, of course, on History Channel, but a very non-serious show about this. And I think that was probably the reason why those video, and I had to split the subject into like four videos because I didn't have the thought to do a long one yet. So they're all, 15, 20 minutes long or whatever. So I did that one. I also did one. There was a popular article I had about the 1960s, 70s cult leader, Carlos Castaneda, the kind of New Age author and cult leader. And when he died in the 90s, he had a very small insular group of women who were following him, basically his acolytes, basically witches, they called themselves that. And they all disappeared within 48 hours of his death. He died of cancer, and then they disappeared. These women disappeared. Years later, they found the bones of one of them out in the desert, but the others have never been found. So I did an interesting article about that, which got some hits, and so I turned that into a YouTube video, and that got some popularity as well. So it was just a very kind of slow ramp up, and I just started using because I switched the servers of my blog in, I think, 2018 or 2019. I had been on WordPress, the free version of WordPress, which is how all the bloggers start. But I didn't realize that I couldn't take, like, my subscribers to that blog would not transfer over when I changed servers. So my blog was dead instantly. I mean, it was just tumbleweeds. So I started doing videos instead, and that's kind of where that got started.
Oh, very cool. But when you look out there at other YouTube channels that are doing the same type of videos, like historical video essays, are there any that you watch that you really like and that you kind of tried to kind of emulate like their style into your videos?
Um, there's some that there's some that I like. As far as emulating, I'm not sure that I've really done that consciously. Um, when I started teaching middle school, I teach in a number of, I'm sort of a kind of freelance teacher, basically. So I'm not like a day-to-day classroom teacher. I'm kind of sort of more of a subject matter expert, and people or institutions or whatever will bring me in for a series of lectures or a limited class or something like that. But I got this gig teaching history at the middle school level at a charter school, and I found, of course, I had never been trained. All the teaching I'd done in my graduate program was of college age kids, and I had done also a lot of presentations, particularly with senior citizens. So I had never really worked with kids. I mean, like younger kids. So that was a trial and error process. And what I found, and this kind of goes, I think, back to what we were talking about at the very beginning, where uh, kids will watch a screen sort of with generally rapt attention, depending on what's being shown, but they'll generally pay more attention to a screen than they will a live person, which is different than when I was in school, but that's fine. Times change. So I'm like, well, gee, I should, incorporate I should find some videos out there and bring those into the classroom, and they'll be more, they'll pay attention, especially if they're kind of funny, or they don't have to be like really kid focused, but at least something to kind of fire their attention, and something that I couldn't do in the classroom itself. So that's kind of where I started surfing YouTube for historical content that was appropriate for my class. And there's a wonderful teacher. He works in New York City, and the name of his channel is Mr. Betts Class. And he started out, I guess, in the mid-teens, but he plays guitar and sings. And so what he would do, at least at the beginning of his channel, he would like parody popular songs and change the lyrics to be about historical events. And he would do these little music videos and eventually it got fairly elaborate, where he would dress up in costumes, and he would have green screen stuff behind him and all this kind of stuff. And but he focused on American history, and I found that was absolutely perfect for my sixth graders, that's the level where they learn American history. And that was just a quantum leap forward, where I was able to start showing Mr. Betts songs in the classroom, and like I'm talking about the Civil War, the coming of the Civil War, what was happening or whatever. And we're going to see this song about like he has one about the John Brown raid, which is hilarious, by the way. And the kids just love that, and they really engage with that. So that's kind of where I started looking at other historians on YouTube. And there's a number of others that will use different, cartoons or clips or, whatever. And some of them, some are obviously better than others. But I did like the fact that there was a lot of engagement and a lot of, dynamic stuff going on there. There's another teacher who I believe was he elementary, or he may have been middle school, but his name is Mr. Beat, not Mr. Beast, but Mr. Beat. And he's a teacher from Kansas, and he has a channel that I admire very much. So, there are other people out there who are doing this. I feel like I'm kind of a latecomer, because my stuff didn't even get noticed until a couple of months ago. But I know Mr. Beat a little bit, and have rubbed shoulders with a couple of others. But so there is sort of a community out there.
Yeah, I like Mr. Beat as well. I've seen a lot of his content. Really enjoy watching his videos as well. With the topics that you choose for your channel, I guess let me ask you this first. How do you choose topics for your channel, and like what is that process like? Do you is kind of anything up for grabs, or do you tend to gravitate towards like certain historical events over others?
Well, it's a lot about just sort of what strikes my fancy, and what I feel interested to kind of put my head in for a while. Especially since I've been doing the very long form videos, which I started my first one of that back in the summer of 2022. So usually it's a topic that I know something about and have some interest in, usually something that I've taught before, or at least have some kind of material compiled about, so I don't have to start from scratch. I will often choose one that has a topic that has either kind of an interesting personality, or some subject that people don't really know about. It's not really, top of the charts as far as, the greatest hits. It might be on the fringe of something, or else a well-known topic that I can do in a sort of a different way that people haven't seen before, like the Manson video, for example, would be a good example of that. Or something that I have also picked topics where, particularly for the deep dives, that I don't think have really been done as well on YouTube as I think they could be. So that was sort of the genesis of the Iran-Contra video, where most of the videos about it are 20 minutes tops, and they're so surface level, and they have to be, because to do a subject that complex in 20 minutes, you're leaving automatically 90% of what happened out of the story. And so I'm like, gee, well, what if I did a really deep dive and got into the personalities and the deal and how it worked and the blow by blow and all this kind of stuff? Nobody's done that. There was another one that I did, and I did this partially for my one of my classes, but I was teaching, and this was at the seventh grade level, and I wanted to talk about there was a series of wars in the 7th century between the Byzantine Empire and the Persian Sassanid Empire, which very few people, it's not, again, not a greatest hits type of thing, but it's very important historically because there was this long series of wars. Byzantium eventually kind of wiped out the Persian Empire, but they were so exhausted from having done that they were easy prey for the rise of Islam, which was being founded as this series of wars was playing out. And the weakness of the Byzantine Empire in the wake of this conflict was what enabled the rapid rise of Islam in the mid 7th century. That's a super important story that has a lot of connections to the modern world. And I was looking for a video to show in my class about it, and found one from a fairly well-regarded channel, but it was dull. At least in my opinion, it was dull because there was a lot of maps and a lot of, well, this army went here and this emperor went here and whatever, and then there was a revolt in this city and this kind of stuff. And I'm like, you know what, I could do better than that. So I made a video of my own on that topic, about the Byzantine Sasanian War. And so that was why I chose that topic, was because it hadn't really been done in a way that I thought was appropriate for my class. And I made that video specifically to show in my class, but also to put on YouTube, of course. So a lot of it's kind of personal preference. A lot of it's what I've studied, what I like, what I feel like I can add something to, and what I also feel is underrepresented on YouTube.
Now, as far as the research that goes into these topics, what do you do for that? Are you mainly looking at books, encyclopedias, etc., or are you using a lot of online sources as well?
Usually I'll start with a book or a series of a group of books. So like right now, it will be out I'm sure by the time this interview goes live. But at the time I'm recording this, I'm working on another deep dive, and this one is on the fall of the great monarchies during the early 20th century, the World War I era. So Habsburgs, Hohenzollerns, Romanovs, the Ottoman Empire, and the Eisenhower of China. And I started really because I chose that because one of my favorite history books is in fact this one, which is called The Fall of the Dynasties. Very old book, written in the 60s. But I remember reading this years ago and just being absolutely captivated by it. And I've read some other books about topics similar to that, like, Robert K. Massey was a very popular historian in the 60s and 70s. He wrote Nicholas and Alexandra about the Romanovs, and there's some others who've written really great books. Barbara Tuchman, The Guns of August, about World War I and the causes of World War I. So I've sort of had my head in that space for a long time. And so usually I'll start with a group of books and then kind of write a script or an outline about what I want to cover, and then write the script using the books mainly as main sources. Often there are different things that I have to chase down, details and things like that. Iran Contra was actually very interesting because I started with one of my main sources was a book that had been written in the late 80s, which I had never really seen another book done about it that was as engaging as that one. So that was a main source. So I reread that, but I had to go to various other sources to track down some other aspects of the story, and ended up using as another source. There was a great book that was published in the early 90s full of documents. So it was like primary source documents. And so I used that as a source. And in fact, in the Iran Contra video on the screen times you'll see like actual images of the actual memos that Oliver North wrote. There was a, kind of a smoking gun memo that exposed the diversion of funds to the Contras. So you'll see that on screen, that kind of thing. When I decided to do the Amway Tools cult video, which is kind of an outlier in what I've done, but that was a project that it came out of a couple of books that I read from previous, ex-Amway distributors who were writing these books mostly in the 80s and 90s, trying to expose what was going on. And I happened to find a source. Again, this was online, but there was a wonderful source. If you've seen that video, the centerpiece of it is there's an audio recording of a meeting, a very contentious meeting that occurred at a hotel in Miami. This is in 1983. Basically, the Amway Tools cult, there were two sides within the multi-level marketing business who were dueling for supremacy in the early 80s. And there was, they had it was like something out of The Godfather. They had like this Hood's Congress where they were trying to figure out what to do. And there was a tape recording of that entire meeting, which was just astonishing. And as soon as I heard that and listened to it, I'm like, this has to be the centerpiece of this video. So I do occasionally use online sources, and particularly documents and things like that. A major help in my research has been archive.org, or at least was until the ridiculous lawsuit filed against them by the publishing industry, which is just so many degrees of wrong that it's just not even comprehensible why they would have done this. Well, I guess it's comprehensible money, I suppose. But in response to that lawsuit, archive.org has taken down a lot of books that were on their site and preserved in their archives, which has really limited the reach of my research, where if I would find mention of a book in another book, I would often go find that exact book on archive.org and be able to look up a citation or a document or whatever. That process is now truncated because pending the result of this lawsuit, they've taken down so much stuff. There's still a lot of stuff you can find. So yeah, that's kind of how a sort of a long version of how I do my sources.
Now with the videos or the topics that you choose, do you ever face any criticism or backlash from your videos that like you see like perhaps like in the YouTube comment section?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely so. Yes. Last summer, I did a two-part series on the JFK assassination. And this is, of course, a vector for controversy, but I was motivated to do that. Again, I had a main source that I was using, which was Vincent Bugliosi's book, Reclaiming History, which I had read years ago. It came out in, I believe, 2007. It's literally 1,700 pages, but I read it and was very, very impressed with just how cogently it laid out the facts, that it's absolutely beyond question that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. There was no conspiracy. And that shocks many people, even to say that. So many people that's just beyond the pale. It's like, well, I mean, that's like asserting that gravity doesn't exist. I mean, that the conspiracy theory or some version of it has been so internalized in our society that it's almost heresy to speak of anything else. So I did that video, and of course that has generated a lot of on a daily basis. I get so many abusive comments which I just leave in the moderation queue mostly. But there's oh, you must be a CIA agent, stuff like that, and or I heard that there was a bullet that was found on and like all these just non-facts, but like factoids that people believe or have come to believe in some. So there's lots and lots of that. The Carlos Castaneda video has also been controversial, and I did that one in 2018. What's interesting about that is the main focus of the video is, as I said, about specifically the women who had followed him, who disappeared in the wake of his death. And there was a really great source, a book written by a woman named Amy Wallace. She's now passed away, but she was kind of in the orbit of Castaneda's coven of witches, so to speak. And she was far enough detached from it that she didn't follow the others. And what probably happened, what we think, is they wandered into the desert of Southern California and committed ritual suicide. Is basically, that's the leading theory as to what happened to them. She did not do that and ended up writing this book about her life with Castaneda and her life in this cult. And that was really one of the main sources that I used for that video. The thing about Castaneda is that he wrote these very well regarded New Age books in the late 60s, early 70s. He claimed and he wrote the first of these books when he was pursuing a doctorate degree in anthropology at UCLA. And this was in like 1968. So he claimed that he had met a Native American shaman somewhere in the desert of Mexico and had gone on these great spiritual journeys involving drugs and altered states of consciousness and this kind of thing. And he actually got a PhD in anthropology from UCLA, essentially fraudulently, because they asked him to produce his field notes and his sources, and he couldn't produce them because, of course, he had made it all up. There's also a cultural appropriation aspect to this. Castaneda was a quite accomplished con man. And then eventually, after his run of success with these New Age books that were published mostly in the 70s, then he became sort of this insular cult leader. So I tell obviously his story there, but most of the pushback on that video has been from people who loved his books and insist that he's not a con man. It's like, oh well, he's absolutely true. Everything he wrote was true, and you're just trying to tear him down. It's a shame that you have such a hole in your life that you feel like you have to attack, and all this kind of stuff. And they completely missed the point, because the point of the video is about the women who disappeared, and yet the vast majority of the pushback is about the claim, and it's absolutely supported, that Castaneda was a con man and that his experiences were not real, they were made up. But so many people are focused on him, and that's the big deal for them, is trying to refute the debunking of Castaneda and the substance of what he wrote. And they don't even really get past that to talk about what happened to the women themselves. There's a few that do, but so most of the pushback has been about that. What's very interesting is the sort of the comments on the Oak Island videos, because when they first started to get popular, it's apparently when the TV show was at the height of its popularity. I think it's called The Curse of Oak Island. I've actually
Yeah.
never seen it. It's such worthless. It adds nothing whatsoever to the study of Oak Island. Not that there's really anything to study. It's a scam. But when the show was popular, I would get a lot of pushback on that, and people say, "Oh, well, they found the flood tunnels, and you know, they found Roman artifacts in the swamp that prove it, and it's proof that the Knights Templar were there, and all of this kind of stuff." In fact, on some occasion, I would get hate mail. I would get literally emails from people who were fans of the show, who would say, why are you tearing down these people who are looking for treasure, and you got all your facts wrong, and this shows what a mockery our education system is. If they gave you a PhD and you don't know the first thing about it, and all of this kind of stuff. I don't get that anymore, because the show is now, I guess somebody told me recently that it's still on the air, which I thought it had gone off the air years ago. I didn't even know it was still on the air, but now, now that it's past its peak of popularity, basically people realize that it's just made up. So that's been very interesting, like sort of the pivot on that. And again, when I talk about like negative response, it's really only a fairly small minority of people who have pushed back against it, because even even the JFK videos, which are the most uh, probably the most controversial. I'm just looking them up now.
Hmm.
Um, but even the most controversial one has got 86% likes. So the vast majority of people who have seen this stuff do like it. It's just that there are outliers, people who have different opinions, who are generally more motivated to comment, I think, than many of the people who don't have a visceral reaction to it. So that's what I'd say about that.
Do you think, is it, or how difficult is it to like take somebody who like truly believes in Oak Island or JFK or anything else and have them kind of steer them towards the direction of, hey, this is what it actually is. And how difficult is that? And is that worth doing sometimes if the person just like won't even budge on their viewpoint?
It's extraordinarily difficult, and generally it is not worth doing. The people who are entrenched in sort of alternate narratives of history is really what this is. There's really nothing I mean, they're not interested in facts. And I find this across. There are themes, I think, in many of my videos, not all of them, but I have always been interested in what I call organized deception. That's just a term that I made up, but when somebody, and this would be scams or cults or conspiracy theories or whatever, where somebody or some group of people decides affirmatively to deceive other people for some specific objective, usually money. But Carlos Castaneda falls in that group. Oak Island falls in that group because what Oak Island was, it was actually a scam from the 1850s,
Oh, wow.
and it was a scam to defraud investors in a supposed treasure hunt. So we don't even know who the original scammers were, but their modus operandi was to make up a lot of bizarre claims about this island and then sell shares in their treasure company to fund an expedition to go recover the treasure. And then, of course, they got their funds and skipped town. But the legend that they spun in order to trick investors took on a life of its own, and it came down through popular culture and is now, the scam has reinvented itself. And it's like the History Channel is a scam, and the show is a scam because basically the creators of that show, I don't really know very much about them, except it's clear that they have sold the History Channel on this narrative, which is not true. And they've been making money from it in much the same way that these scammers did in the 1850s. So, uh, with my interest in organized deception, and I've always been interested in why do people fall for these things? Why do they believe? Why do they, what's the pathology of these deceptions? But if people are convinced that a deception is real, they'll do almost anything to avoid confronting that reality. Um, I find this with the Amway Tools Cult video as well, because Amway, of course, multi-level marketing is a deception and a scam. But there's so much material out there about how they hook people and why they continue to believe in the narratives that they posit. And there's some really wonderful stuff out there. There was the documentary a couple of years ago about LuLaRoe that was hot for a while, and various other. Nexium was big in the news about the time of the pandemic. Again, same thing. So when you encounter someone who is still sort of really deeply uh, in that milieu, they didn't get there by reasoned understanding of the facts. You don't join Amway because you've looked at it and you think it's a good business opportunity. You join it because of whatever emotional factor, or you're uh, motivated by their sales pitch, or whatever, and you justify it to yourself, well, this is a good thing because of X, Y, and Z. um, and I think once you get into that sort of mindset, it's very difficult to get people out. So my videos that are about organized deception are not geared toward undoing that damage. I'm not trying to get people out of Amway or to get them to stop believing in Carlos Castaneda. My videos are not for the people who believe in those things. They're for people who are interested in how these things work and what the history is of them. I have had some many years ago, actually in uh, the era when 9/11 conspiracies were really big. I dabbled in the debunking community online, which has its own uh, issues of toxicity and that sort of thing, which is eventually why I left. But about 2006 or so, which was the high watermark of 9/11 trutherism. Of course, I encountered online a lot of people who were deeply believed in these conspiracy theories, and it's eventually it becomes pointless to argue with them because they're never going to understand what the facts really are, or they're not going to accept what are the facts as opposed to a fake fact that they have convinced themselves to believe. So yes, it is very difficult to get people out, and it's generally not worth doing. It's in my opinion. Once in a while, I'll get a message or a comment from somebody who said, "Wow, I used to believe this, and thank you so much. Uh, your presentation showed me that I had been wrong in thinking this, and it's now clear to me," or whatever. And of course, I like those comments. It's wonderful to be able to do that, but they are exceptionally rare.
I will say with the JFK videos that you did, that definitely opened my eyes to a lot of things that I didn't know, and very well done videos. I highly recommend people to watch them or any of your videos for that matter. I wanted to ask you this regarding this topic. Do you find that sometimes this focus or like people's focus on alternative history kind of hurts the movement, and it shifts focus from areas where we should be focusing on? And to the subject of September 11th, I actually interviewed a guy who has a YouTube channel, Adam Fitzgerald, and he does research into September 11th. And this is it's kind of his stance is that, hey, there's like, we need to set aside the stuff with no planes or the buildings were taken down, because there's actually stuff that we should be asking questions about, like why didn't we confront, uh, if we knew about the hijackers, how come we couldn't stop it, and how did they come into the country, and why was, there was, I forget, Nawif al-Hazmi was in Arizona in 1997, but, when the FBI tried to bring it up, nobody really took a look into it, and the CIA and the FBI weren't really communicating. So his position is, why aren't we looking at these things and we're focusing on these other things? And I don't know if you find that similarly in other like historical videos or historical events that we've just mentioned. Is there too much attention to like these alternative histories that it hurts like the actual truth and the focus in other areas?
Absolutely, yes, absolutely. And 9/11 is a great example. Um, I have not. I've toyed with the idea of doing something related to 9/11, but it's a tricky area, in part because YouTube's content restrictions treat 9/11 as a special case, and their rules about what you can do about it and what you can show are unclear and also inconsistent with the rest of the rules. So that's a different issue. But I think what you brought up is exactly right. One of the things about 9/11 that is, and this is mentioned, I did a video about, this is before my real run of popularity began, but a long time ago I did a video about, was Bin Laden a CIA agent? Well, he wasn't, um, but that idea got into the public mind, and it's like, oh yeah, the CIA funded Bin Laden. No, they didn't. It's more complicated than that. Um, but one of the reasons, probably the primary reason, I mean, most Americans, I think, don't really realize why 9/11 happened, what the strategic vision was. It wasn't, and part of this was because the political narratives were spun after it. Oh, they did it because they hate our freedoms, or which is nonsense, of course. The strategic reason behind 9/11 was that bin Laden wanted to bait the United States into invading Afghanistan because he believed that it would be a quagmire. And since he thought that the Soviet war in Afghanistan was the direct and proximate cause of the collapse of communism, he believed that getting the United States involved in a similar war would lead to the same kind of collapse of the United States. That was why he did it. Very few people understand that that's what the strategic reason was. So I think you're right. It's like, well, while we're being distracted by ridiculous theories about how, oh, the plane was a hologram, very few people have realized that, like, we, the United States, responded to 9/11 in exactly the way that Osama bin Laden wanted us to. It didn't have the results that he expected because he was not a very deep thinker in terms of geopolitics, a very shallow thinking. Bin Laden was not a smart man. I mean, he was clever, but he wasn't very smart. But there's been very little discussion about the strategic implications of that, which I think is worth a discussion. Should we have invaded Afghanistan in 2001? Should we have stayed there for 20 years? No one's really talking about that. So I think that's a great example. Um, just to link to something that is in a recent video I did, the Manson case. I'm very interested, and you'll see in that video, I'm very interested in the narratives about uh, Manson and the end of the 60s. What did it mean? And there's lots of different aspects of this, Altamont and, things like that, and the Woodstock generation, and all of these things are caught up in that. A couple of years ago, there was a book that was written um, examining or I would say asking a lot of questions. I mean, it wasn't really didn't really come to any conclusions, but there were a lot of questions about, well, was Manson given drugs in prison? Was he part of the MK Ultra program or whatever? And when there's any whiff of particularly a CIA related conspiracy, people will lob onto that as like, that's the biggest thing about this. And I deliberately chose not to. I in fact even mentioned that book. I believe it's called Chaos, is the name of the book. But I specifically mentioned in that video that no, I'm not going to do this subject. It's fine, but it's outside the scope of what I want to do. And I think that's an example too, because as soon as people are very interested in conspiracies, and so much of popular knowledge about history is completely infused with conspiracy theory. So when you dangle a red flag like that in front of people, oh, the CIA was involved in, and just fill in the blank. It doesn't matter what event. People are often going to kind of gravitate toward that subject and often miss the broader dimensions of what we're really talking about. So I agree with what you said, that I think the focus on these kinds of things really does a disservice to the reasoned understanding of history.
And particularly with a video like the JFK videos that you did, how difficult is it to discern from sources like you mentioned you read Vincent Bugliosi's book, and I know you consulted like the Warren Commission's report in your making of the video, um, and I know those are like very good sources for researching this topic. But how do you identify what what is not like a good source? Like if you look at a like a book like the JFK book, best
Oh,
evidence.
best evidence. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's often fairly obvious. The first thing, and again, this comes from my kind of history training. When you look at a book, the first thing you want to look at is the footnotes and the endnotes. First of all, if it doesn't have them, red flag. Unless it's designed as, a capsule summary of it, or a popular, whatever, but you have to take those in a certain uh, way. But if it's actually purporting to be a history of something, or it's presenting an argument about something, the first thing you do is you look at what sources did they cite. And if you look at, if the sources are other similar books by other people who are saying much the same thing, that's probably a bad source. The vast majority of JFK conspiracy books will cite other JFK conspiracy authors, or they'll cite the Warren Commission, which is bizarre that they all think the Warren Commission is complete crap, and yet that's the number one source that conspiracy theorists will cite, because that's the best repository of documentary knowledge about the assassination. Actually, the even better source on JFK is the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and particularly the appendices to that, not even the main report, which very few people have even heard of, the House Select Committee, but even fewer people know that there's literally volumes of extremely exacting documentation on every aspect of the assassination. That was an invaluable source for my video. A good example. There's a book that I believe I mentioned in one of my Oak Island videos, and it's called I think it's called Oak Island Secrets. It was published in the late 90s. One of these sort of fly-by-night publishers, and the author at least purports to cite sources, but if you look at the sources, they're all, you know, they're all gonzo type of speculative fringe sources. This happens a lot. I have not done a video involving Nazi occultism, but this is a big problem in that topic, where every book that's written about, you know, the Nazis were practitioners of black magic, and Hitler was trying to get his hands on this artifact or that artifact. If you look at what they cite, they'll cite other conspiracy authors. So it's generally pretty easy to tell a good source from a bad one. Another way to do it is, if you can look at what argument they're making, you can usually tell if there's great leaps of logic that just don't add up, or completely speculative. Best Evidence is a great example, because that book is essentially content free. I mean, there's really nothing in that book that's worth really anything, because of the great leaps of logic, terrible sourcing, terrible writing. One of the things that amazes me is a conspiracy theory within the JFK milieu that's apparently very hot, is the idea that a Secret Service agent accidentally shot Kennedy when he was trying to return the fire from the school book depository. And there was a gonzo book written in the early 90s that posited this theory. Bugliosi was so horrified by just the ridiculousness of that claim that he dismisses it in a couple of paragraphs. Unfortunately, that particular claim has become super hot in the last 10 years or so, and there's a lot of people who believe it. It's nonsense, of course. It's absolute nonsense, because what you have to do to get there is to explain away the proof that Oswald fired 3 shots, because in order to make that work, he has to fire 2. He can't have fired a 3rd shot. But that amazes me that so many people believe in that story, but the books that talk about that theory are terrible. Again, they suffer from these exact problems that I've talked about, but yet a lot of people are not able to discern a good source from a bad one, and so we get into those kinds of weeds.
Mhm. Shifting gears a little bit, I wanted to compliment you on another video that you did on the Persian Gulf War, and very very detailed. An episode of history that I actually, let me see, I missed actually, because I'm 30. I'm about to turn 32, and I was born after, like slightly after this happened. And I wanted to kind of talk to you about this war because it seems like it's something that's kind of, at least to me, I don't, it's not in my purview all the time. Like I hear about World War II all the time. I hear about Vietnam a lot, obviously with stuff that happened after September 11th and the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan. But what happened in the early 90s, I feel like I don't hear about it as much today. And I was wondering, do you feel the same? And is that kind of what inspired you to bring more attention to this time period in our history?
Yes, I do think that that is very neglected. One of the reasons I decided to do that video, and I had done previously, that video is based on a lot of material that I created for an online course that is on my website, SeanMunger.com. And I guess it was about, year and a half ago, I did an audio only course about the Persian Gulf War. And so I used those scripts as sort of the basis for my video. But the reason why I decided to do that, when I was doing my PhD and in the kind of the later stages of it, I not only did teaching assistant duties for professors, but I also was assigned toward the end of my program to teach some classes on my own as instructor of record. So one of the professors that I worked for had done a class on specifically on the Iraq War, meaning the one that started in 2003. I took the course, and then later, about 2 years later, during the summer session, this professor, they wanted to offer that course in the summer session, but this professor was unavailable, and so he suggested to the department, well, let's get Sean to teach that class. So I did that class, which was very, very interesting and very fulfilling. A lot of veterans ended up taking that course, which was super interesting. But when I took the course that was developed by my professor, he spent very little time on that first war. And I remember I'm older than you, so I do remember it happening. And we were just riveted to the TV for weeks on end. So it seemed like a big deal at the time, and then later it became less of a big deal. I'll explain why in a little bit. But I thought that it kind of got short shrift. The professor that I worked for was great. I loved working for him. I worked for him many, many times. But I decided when I was going to do the course on my own that I was going to beef up that section, that I wanted to talk about that first war before going into the second one because they're so connected. And even then, I couldn't spend as much time on it as I thought it needed. So that's why I did the course on my website about it, and then translated that into the Persian Gulf War video. I think it is super important, and it relates to what was happening in the 80s. So there are relations also to the Iran-Contra story. And then, of course, what happened in the 90s, and 9/11 sort of brought an abrupt end to that. But I think why the Persian Gulf War is obscure is because the process of there's even really not very good history about it. There's very few. That was hard to find good sources because there are very few historical, like truly good, well-researched historical books about that specific conflict. And the reason for that is because when it happened in the early 90s, there was a wave of books that came out within the first 2 years after it was over. And they generally fell into two categories. One of them were memoirs by usually military commanders, people who were advanced in their career at the time it happened. They served in the Gulf, they commanded, tank battalions or whatever, and then they retired in, 1992 or whatever, and then they wrote this book about the Gulf War. So there's the military story, and those books are fine from a military perspective, but they're incomprehensible to most people because you look at them, and if you open a book about the Persian Gulf War and the first thing you see is a map with little squares representing like tank battalions or whatever, and they'll always have acronyms, and you look at the page and there's just like the page is just aglow with all these capital letter military acronyms. That's a certain genre of Persian Gulf War history. So that was the first wave, and concurrent with that wave, then the other kind of people who wrote books about the Persian Gulf War in that first couple of years after it tended to be people who studied journalism and media. And the hot topic there was, how was the war covered? The Pentagon's process of embedding reporters. How did the story get delivered? And so there was a wave of scholarship about that. And then in the 90s, there were some good books about it. Some of them came out of the Arab world, actually, and were not translated into English. But it takes at least about 10 years or so after a big historical event for the first really useful histories to to be published about it. And the problem with the Persian Gulf War was that 10 years after it, suddenly 9/11 happened. And then suddenly we were off to the races on the second Iraq War, which sort of it sucked all the oxygen out of scholarship or even a desire to study that first war. And then it became a package. And so now now that we've been out of the Iraq War for 12 years, you see there's now a lot of really good scholarship coming out about it. But that's now the focus, is that second war. The first war is usually dealt with as kind of a prelude to it. So there's not really much about it specifically. And it was because the process of memorializing it and studying it historically was truncated by 9/11 and the second war. And that also happened kind of politically and in the popular consciousness, because suddenly, once 9/11 happens, and now we're arguing about, well, should we invade Iraq to get rid of weapons of mass destruction or whatever, no one's thinking about that first war. It's like, well, that doesn't matter anymore now, because now we've got this other set of circumstances, and it's more recent, and many more people were involved who have a recent memory of it. Whereas now Iraq, Persian Gulf War veterans are starting to get into middle age, and they're kind of becoming the way that Vietnam veterans were at the time of the Persian Gulf War. So there's this weird process of memorializing of history and of kind of fitting historical events into popular consciousness. And the Persian Gulf War was a special case because that process was short-circuited prematurely, which is why it's so obscure. So long answer to a very simple question, but that's what I think about that.
One of the things that I found amazing from watching your video was how George H.W. Bush couldn't. It seems like, and correct me if I'm wrong, like couldn't capitalize on the vast approval and just positive energy towards him to uh, get reelected in what was 1992. And I know you kind of went into that as well in your video, correct?
I did, yes, kind of extensively, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Which then in 1992, Bill Clinton gets elected. And then we have, the rest of history from there. Yeah, really well done and very, very detailed. Another aspect of that video, actually, and I wanted to get into this, was the climate aspect of the Persian Gulf War, because I know it relates to your studies. And I was wondering, can you explain just a little bit about what you spoke about in that video about how the Persian Gulf War affected climate from, just burning of the oil fields, et cetera, things like that?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, there are a lot of connections, I think, between the Persian Gulf War and global warming, and that there's some people that any mention of climate change in a video is a red line for some people. It's like, oh, I'm stopping to watch right now. So I've got a lot of comments about that, but there is a deep, deep relationship there. Not least of all the fact that the strategic reasons why Kuwait mattered to the United States and the West was because of the ultimate accessibility of oil, which is causing, the burning of fossil fuels, of course, is causing climate change. So there's a connection there. in history, I often ask the questions and often encourage my students to ask not only why did this happen, but why did it happen when it happened? Why didn't it happen 10 years earlier or 10 years later or whatever? There's an interesting convergence in time. The first um, report, the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN sort of umbrella scientific organization studying global warming, their first report, which is their most important one, they had been working on it since 1988, but it came out in July of 1990, exactly 1 month before Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. So there's an interesting convergence in time there. When I was working on a climate consulting project, and I had occasion to look at documents from the first White House, principally involving John Sununu and some of other Bush's advisors. And I talk about this a little bit in the video, where they, during the early part of 1990, they were anticipating the release of the IPCC report, and Sununu, who was a fairly notorious global warming denier, attempted to negotiate with the IPCC to uh, soften the report and get rid of the catastrophic language, and, well, can we water this down, can we water that down? And there are lots of memos and such in the Bush the first White House that go through this story of how he tried to engage the IPCC and get them to double, to water down their conclusions. And when that failed completely, IPCC report outraged Sununu. Bush just didn't care. He was not engaged on the issue whatsoever. But Sununu was absolutely outraged. And he was so bitter that for the rest of the time that Sununu was in charge, he was eventually cashiered about a year before the election. But he was notoriously hostile to anything involving climate change. And he basically turned the US government's official policy on climate change from kind of a cautious engagement to total denial. And that the Clinton administration did not really, I mean, they engaged with the issue a bit more, but they didn't really reverse that sort of crystallization of denial as sort of the main policy. So I think that's a very important part of the story, because that was happening at the exact same time that the diplomatic crisis before the war was ramping up. And I mentioned in the video that the protest movement, there was kind of a nascent protest movement against the first Persian Gulf War. It didn't go anywhere because it was over so quickly. But the key slogan, the slogan that stuck, was "No blood for oil," basically. And that was a less compelling narrative for that protest movement than any of the narratives from the Vietnam era. And I mentioned this in the video, that it's like, I mean, if you're going to have a major protest movement against something, your message has to be very clear, and it has to be very simple and very compelling. Vietnam had that message, and the civil rights movement had that message. Very simple. You knew automatically what Dr. Martin Luther King wanted. You knew automatically what Tom Hayden wanted and Jane Fonda. It was clear. The protest movement against the Persian Gulf War, as it was developing, was not really very clear. It had something to do with oil, and it was more like, well, like the Vietnam movement was about, this war is not in our national interest. Let's get out, because we're doing all these terrible things, and it's not worth it to us. Basically, was kind of the point. At the Gulf stage, it was more like, well, this war is in our national interest, but we wish it wasn't. That's a different message. And maybe if the war had gone on longer and the protest movement had gained more steam, I wonder if climate change would have become sort of part of the message against the war. It's like, no, let's not go fight for petroleum producing countries in the Middle East. Let's abolish fossil fuels, because we're going to have to anyway. So there is a connection there. There are also, as you pointed out, more direct connections. Uh, when Saddam retreated from Kuwait, he lit something like 700 of the oil wells on fire, and that created a cloud of smoke. And there was some scientific concern that the smoke from burning oil wells would have an effect on the climate. And the people who raised that alarm were the same people in the scientific community who had, you know, 10 years earlier sounded the alarm about nuclear winter. Carl Sagan was one of the spokespeople for this movement. And the particularly Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher administrations, I talk a lot about Margaret Thatcher in my Persian Gulf video, because you cannot tell the story of that conflict without it was not the United States alone, and British involvement, and it's particularly British politics, because Thatcher was deposed during that crisis. That led to a whole other set of circumstances. But both the Reagan and Thatcher administrations were notoriously hostile toward the scientific work on nuclear winter theory. And that hostility eventually resurfaced as hostility toward scientific research on climate change. And for much the same reasons, it threatened deeply seated interests in conservative governments. So I think there are a lot of connections there that are worth talking about, and no one is talking about them. So that's what I think on that.
I was reading too the article that you wrote, and I forget the title of it right now, on that storm that swept through New England in the 1800s. It was like a gale storm.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned something in there about people in the past kind of had this idea of that, hey, we're all connected, like on this earth.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to ask you, do you think have we kind of always thought about the climate like, people are thinking about today, as far as the impact on the climate? Has that been a pervasive thought in previous years?
Well, yes. I mean, I think that people have generally considered human activity to be related to the climate. It's really only the idea that, well, human beings can't affect the climate. That's a denialist trope that is fairly recent. That idea has only really been pushed as heavily as it has since the late 80s, basically, which was the kind of when climate denial was invented. Um, People think that, oh well, climate change is it's a new thing, or it's and but it was very well, it was not controversial until about 1989. Part of the reason why 1989 is because that's when George Bush the first took office, and there were petroleum and fossil fuel industry interests who were targeting the Bush White House with communications that hoped to push them toward a denialist direction. And there was the first concerted effort to do that was in about 1989. So the idea that, oh, we can't affect the climate, that's a very recent idea. Previous to that, it was generally assumed that human beings and the climate were interrelated. One of the examples that I give of this was if you look at Thomas Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia, he talks about climate change. He talks about human-caused climate change. Not a controversial idea in 1780. In fact, in the 19th century, people believed that human beings and climate were very closely related, to the extent that, like, nations and civilizations in similar climate circumstances would develop similarly. This idea is somewhat dangerous because, of course, it later became a justification for colonialism and exploitation of Africa and Asia and that kind of thing. But that came later generally. But those ideas were very mainstream, and it was not a controversial idea. It really isn't a controversial idea today outside of circles that are politically motivated to deny climate change. But yeah, I think that idea is very basic and finds a lot of expression in history. in many different ways.
To kind of wrap things up, Sean, because I we've been going, it's almost an hour and a half. I wanted to ask you, do you get people like pinging you for like suggestions on new videos? And
Mhm.
um, I guess do you ever think get topics from people suggesting? And then also as another question, what I know earlier you mentioned a video that you're working on, but any other big deep dives that you have coming up?
Yeah, well, I'll take the first part of that first. I do get suggestions all the time. Um, some are very, very good. Others, are not so good, or it's not that they're not good, but they're not really kind of within my wheelhouse, or something that I feel that I could do without becoming, starting anew as an expert on the topic. Um, Often these suggestions sort of rise and fall based on what's in the news at any particular time. I've had a couple of comments and requests for people to do something on the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I got a very good suggestion a couple of weeks ago from someone who was interested in a video about the Troubles in Northern Ireland, which is one that I have considered doing. That's a very steep research and learning curve, so that's kind of what's daunting about that. Um, and there are people who have some, just kind of interesting, sort of off the wall suggestions, which are often very interesting. I'm not sure that I'm going to do them, but I do appreciate hearing from people about those kinds of things, and it's great to hear because people are interested in the past. And one of the things that my long form videos I think have shown, we talk about, oh well, people's attention spans are so short or whatever. I don't think that's really true. I think people want, my most successful videos are the super long ones. The Persian Gulf War video is 2.5 hours long. And there's people who've said that they've watched it like 3 times in a day. I mean, I can't even imagine that, but there are people who have said that kind of thing. And so that kind of amazes me, that people really do have a desire to understand the deep context of history. I think because it's, that kind of thing is dealt with so infrequently. Most historical videos are, 10 to 15 minutes long. And that's just not enough time, I think, really to do something in a really deep way. I have done videos of that length, but they tend to be more surface level. As to what I'm working on, this new video that I'm in editing on, it's going to be out fairly soon. I'm sure it will be out by the time this interview goes up, is, as I said, about the fall of the great monarchies in the World War I era. There's going to be a side video related to that, which is an explanation of what we call the July crisis. That's sort of how the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, that was the trigger, how that led to the outbreak of World War I about 5 weeks later. Very complicated process, one of the most difficult things to explain in modern history. So I thought that was worth sort of breaking out into its own video. So that's going to be dropping at the same time. I'm also, next in the pipeline after that, you saw the Manson video, which was titled Manson, A Geographic History. And my approach there was to look at the Manson story not as a narrative from beginning to end, but talking about the various geographic places within that story and how they fit together in an interesting way. So my next video after Fall of Monarchies is going to be Watergate, A Geographic History, which is going to surprise some people because I think we're used to thinking of, well, Watergate has nothing to do with geography. It's just, men in rooms talking and sometimes being tape recorded. It's not that. The spark of this idea was uh, a article that I did on my blog about the history of the Watergate site itself, the place where the building was eventually constructed in the early 60s, which is connected to, I mean, there's a residence there with apartments and that kind of thing. Ruth Bader Ginsburg lived there for decades, but that's also connected to the office complex where the break-in occurred. But that site has an interesting history in itself. It was a railroad site in the 19th century. It was a utility site in the early part of the 20th century. But if you just scratch the surface of the history of the Watergate site, you uncover a lot of really interesting connections. For example, one of the main, it appears that there's been some recent scholarship on this, but one of the underlying causes of Nixon's paranoia was a fear that the fact that his campaign had negotiated secretly with the North Vietnamese to it was involving the election of 1968, and the Nixon administration did not want a bombing pause to occur right before the election. They thought that that would boomerang to their disfavor in the election, and so the Nixon administration had kind of secret connections uh, with North Vietnam to stretch out the peace talks that were going on at that time. And the Johnson administration, still in office, found out at the time that that was going on. They did not expose it for very complex reasons. But Nixon was apparently very paranoid that news of that incident would leak out during his presidency. And his creation of the plumbers was in part to prevent those documents from being made public. Now, what's interesting about this story is that one of Nixon's secret envoys to the North Vietnamese, Madame Chennault, lived at, guess what? The Watergate
Well,
complex.
yeah.
So that's just random. Okay, I mean, there's not a historical connection there other than something that happened to be caused by randomness. But isn't that an interesting story?
Oh
And
yeah.
that's not the only thread like that in the Watergate story. So that's why I'm interested to look at that. So that's what's coming up next after the fall of the dynasties.
You know what's so funny? I actually wrote down a couple suggestions, and Watergate was one of my suggestions I was going to mention. So that's so funny that you beat me right to
Yeah,
it.
yeah. And again, it was I was working on it. I had it in my head before this happened, but I did receive a comment on one of my videos suggesting that I do Watergate. So
I wrote down two others. One of them, you've probably gotten suggestions on these two. The Great Financial Crisis of
mm,
2008, um, as well as the Bill Clinton's impeachment trial and the
mm,
Lewinsky
mm,
scandal.
mm.
Knowing what you've done with your other videos, I have no doubt you would make awesome videos regarding those topics. I don't. Has anybody ever suggested those to you?
Uh, yes, actually, I have had suggestion of the 2008 crisis. Um, I would have a little bit more competition in that space because I know that there have been some people on YouTube who've done some very interesting stuff on that. There's a research curve on that as well, just because of the economics and that sort of thing. I'm not an economist, but I guess I know enough to be dangerous on that topic. Clinton and Lewinsky, I would love to do, and I have thought about doing it and have received suggestions to do it. It's not quite in the same category as 9/11, but it's a little tricky from YouTube's content restrictions because they consider uh, sexual assault to be what they call a sensitive topic, and so there are certain content rules around that it's not undoable, but I would have to kind of navigate my way around that. And of course, as you know, there are very complex issues in that scandal involving consent or meaningful consent, or Clinton has been credibly accused of sexual assault in a number of other instances. So that's sort of a fraught topic, but that would not necessarily scare me off. And it's a super interesting, very very interesting story.
Hmm. Yeah. Again, something like that. I was just a little too young to really know what was going on, but I do remember the events of 2008, the
Mm-hmm,
Lehman
mm-hmm.
Brothers collapse, stock market crash. I do remember that stuff. So yeah, again, I have no doubt that if you do choose to do a video on that, it would make for an awesome time, and I would watch it multiple times over.
Great. Well, I may do it. What I'm thinking, just even as you've been talking, is focusing not so much on the nuts and bolts of the financial collapse, but kind of how it played out politically, because there's a lot of interesting stuff that was going on there with the presidential campaign and kind of McCain's last hurrah and the whole Sarah Palin issue and that kind of thing, the surge. Um, so yeah, there's that could be something I could do.
Well, this has been a great conversation, Sean. I've learned a ton. It's been great talking to you. Just really quick before we go, for people that want to get in contact with you or reach you, what are the best avenues to do that?
Email is the best. It's my email address is just Sean@SeanMunger.com, and my website is just simply SeanMunger.com. And I do receive a lot of emails on kind of a daily basis. So if I don't get back to you right away, uh, understand that I've received so much more attention over the last couple of months than I ever had before. So I'm still getting used to fielding, an inbox full of questions every morning. So I'm still navigating my way through that process, but that is the best way to get in touch with me. I do have a public Facebook page and an Instagram page. This was just kind of like posting stuff related to my work, but my YouTube channel is kind of where most of the activity is going on at this point in time. But I also do have some courses online that there's a kind of a grab bag of classes, and you can sign up for $5 a month and get access to. There's one that I really, really like that I did a number of years ago and recorded. It was a class on the Vietnam War. And if you just kind of sign up, you sign up for 1 month or 2 months and then can't, go through what you want to go through and then cancel. A lot of people do that. So there's, stuff on there as well.
And I'll include links to these websites. Also, your social media. I'll include it in the episode description for people to check out. Highly recommended. Again, thank you so much. I've learned a ton from your videos, and thanks for doing this. I really
Great.
appreciate it.
Well, thank you. It was a pleasure.
And for everybody else out there, thank you very much for listening. My name is Chris. This has been Chee-Tash. Take care, everybody.